Welcome back to Animal Encounters. I'm Jaxon. Today we look at 5 fatal wildlife encounters where warnings were ignored or misunderstood. A bear in North Carolina, a lion enclosure entry, a crocodile river crossing, habituated coyotes, and an elephant mock charge. These aren't accidents, they're consequences. We start in North Carolina. It was June 14th, 2017. The air in the western North Carolina mountains carried the particular humidity of early summer, the kind that settles into the tree canopy and holds the smell of soil and pine long after the morning fog has lifted. Temperatures that afternoon had climbed into the low 80s, and the light filtering through the hardwood canopy came in broken, shifting columns that moved with the breeze. Emily Carter was 26 years old. She had grown up in the mid-Atlantic region and had spent much of her early 20s building a life around outdoor experiences, trail running, weekend camping, and the kind of spontaneous detours off marked paths that she documented regularly through her phone. Friends described her as enthusiastic and social, someone who approached new environments with curiosity rather than caution. She was not an inexperienced hiker. She had walked trails like these before, had encountered wildlife at a distance on previous trips, and carried herself with the casual confidence of someone comfortable in the backcountry. Emily stepped off the marked trail after spotting a black bear foraging approximately 25 meters into the dense brush. The animal appeared calm, moving slowly between fallen logs and low vegetation, its attention directed downward. There was no visible agitation, no raised posture, no orientation toward the trail. To Emily, the scene looked unremarkable, a bear doing what bears do in early summer, indifferent to the presence of people on the nearby path. She raised her phone and began recording as she closed the distance. What the brush line concealed were 2 cubs, positioned higher up the slope, partially obscured by the dense foliage. They were small enough that their presence was not obvious from the angle Emily had taken, and she had no way of knowing they were there. Nothing in what she could see gave her any reason to suspect that the animal she was approaching was anything other than a solitary bear, calm and occupied. The problem was that the distance she considered reasonable and the distance the sow considered acceptable were not the same. And the sow was operating with information Emily did not have. Black bears are not, by default, aggressive animals. The majority of documented encounters between humans and black bears end without physical contact of any kind. The behavioral calculus changes entirely, however, in the presence of offspring. A sow with cubs operates under a fundamentally different set of triggers than a solitary bear. Proximity, sudden movement, and the vocalizations of the cubs themselves are all capable of initiating a defensive response that has nothing to do with the bear's general temperament or prior behavior around humans. The response is not considered. It is fast, committed, and oriented entirely toward removing the threat from the vicinity of the cubs by whatever means are necessary. The cubs reacted first. As Emily continued to close the distance, they climbed slightly and produced soft distress vocalizations. Sounds quiet enough to be missed by a human observer focused on the adult animal below, but carrying specific and urgent meaning to the sow. The moment those sounds reached her, the nature of the encounter changed completely. What had been a foraging bear in a forest became an adult female in a defensive state, with cubs behind her and an unidentified figure closing the distance from below. Emily continued moving closer, still unaware of the cubs behind the brush line, still recording. At approximately 15 meters, the sow issued a sharp huff and performed a short forward rush that stopped several meters short of her position. This is a documented warning behavior, a bluff charge. It is the animal communicating, through committed movement and sound, that the distance between them has become unacceptable and that the intruder needs to increase that distance immediately. It is not an attack. It is a high-intensity warning that often precedes escalation if the person fails to increase distance, though a bear may issue more than one before contact, and a steady, deliberate, retreat can still break the cycle at this stage. The correct response is immediate, deliberate retreat. Steady backward movement that increases the distance without presenting the visual stimulus of a fleeing target. Emily stopped moving. She took several awkward steps backward, but did not create meaningful distance. She remained within the threshold the bear had already defined as a threat zone. The phone was still raised. The cubs were still on the slope above. The cubs vocalized again. The second charge did not stop. The sow covered the remaining distance and made full contact, driving Emily to the ground. The uneven slope she had descended to reach the bear had already compromised her footing before the charge. Root systems and loose rock made any clean retreat impossible. And when contact came, she went down hard with no ability to cover herself effectively. She was not still. The disorientation of the impact and the involuntary impulse to push upright meant she was moving. And as long as she was moving, the sow's threat assessment did not reset. The attack was not continuous, but it did not end cleanly either. It stopped and restarted with each movement Emily made, until there was no more movement to restart it. By the time the sow finally withdrew toward the cubs, the damage to the vascular structures of the neck had already progressed to the point that the outcome was functionally determined. Emily's phone was recovered a short distance from where she had fallen. It was still recording. The footage captured the approach and the initial escalation before the moment of impact. It was reviewed by wildlife authorities in the days that followed. She had stepped several hundred meters off the marked trail into terrain that did not feature on any mapped route, and the distance from the path meant that no other hiker heard anything. Search teams organized by friends who had reported her missing that evening located her just after dark. She was alive when found, but the blood loss from the neck and scalp lacerations was severe, and the time elapsed between the attack and medical contact, combined with the remoteness of the location and the distance required to reach a clearing accessible to evacuation, placed her outside the window in which the injuries could be managed. She was airlifted but did not survive the transport. Footage of the incident was not released in respects for her family's privacy. Emily Carter had approached a wild animal unaware of what the brush concealed. The next case removes that mitigating factor entirely. In South Africa, a man who knew exactly what he was dealing with walked into its enclosure anyway. It was September 3rd, 2015. The dry heat of the South African Lowveld had settled into the afternoon in the way it does in early spring, flat, direct, and unbroken by cloud cover. The bush around the property was pale and brittle, the grasses bleached by months without significant rainfall, the acacia trees casting thin shadows across cracked red soil. The air smelled of dust and dry vegetation, and sound carried clearly in the stillness of the afternoon. From my perspective, this is already a high-alert environment before anything even happens. Marcus Hale was 34 years old. He had spent the better part of a decade working in and around wildlife facilities, accumulating hands-on experience with large predators that went well beyond casual familiarity. Colleagues described him as composed and knowledgeable, someone who took his work seriously and understood the theoretical risks of what he did. He had worked with lions before, had been in proximity to large felids in professional capacities on multiple occasions, and had developed a working familiarity with the male lion housed on the property, a captive-born male that had been hand-reared and routinely exposed to human presence during development, handled by staff across its growth, and integrated into the rhythms of the facility in ways that wild lions never are. Animals raised with human contact do not become domesticated. They become habituated, and the distinction matters enormously when the animal in question is a fully grown male lion. Habituation reduces the fear response. It does not alter the predatory architecture of the animal, its physical capability, or the conditions under which that capability can be triggered. A lion that has spent years around humans retains every physical attribute that makes it one of the most effective large predators on the planet. The sense of predictability that extended familiarity creates is a perception held by the human, not a behavioral reality in the animal. The pattern of uneventful entries had accumulated into a working assumption that the risk was manageable. The gradual erosion of caution through repeated uneventful exposure until the behavior that was once recognized as high risk had been reclassified through experience as routine. Marcus entered the enclosure alone on the afternoon of September 3rd. This was not the first time he had done so. I wouldn't have done that alone. That's the part that stands out immediately. As he moved into the space, the lion began to circle, not a direct approach, but a lateral repositioning that changed the geometry between them without closing the distance directly. Its tail moved in slow, intermittent flicks. Its head remained level and still. These are not signs of agitation. They are signs of focus, the quiet behavioral shift that precedes predatory commitment in large felids. The animal was not alarmed. It was not reacting defensively. It was in a focused predatory assessment phase. The lion's movement slowed. Its body lowered slightly, the weight shifting forward, its eyes fixed on Marcus without breaking contact. The unbroken visual lock that experienced handlers recognize as a significant change in the animal's behavioral state, a shift from passive awareness to active targeting. Marcus reached toward the animal at close range. I don't think this was the right thing to do. There's no safe version of that action. The lion closed the distance without warning vocalization, without a preliminary swipe, without any of the escalating signals that might have provided a moment to react. There was no escalation, because there was no conflict. The animal had already made the decision to kill. It committed fully and immediately, clamping onto the upper neck, applied with precision and sustained pressure, targeting the structures that, once compromised, end the struggle quickly. There was no prolonged physical contest. Staff reached the enclosure and intervened, but by the time entry into the enclosure was possible, the engagement had already reached its critical phase. Marcus did not survive. The facility was subjected to a formal investigation, and the protocols around solo enclosure entry were reviewed and revised. The lion was not euthanized. It had behaved as a lion. Marcus Hale had built his assumption of safety through years of working alongside a single animal. In Australia's Northern Territory, the next case required no prior relationship at all, only a river crossing, a set of warning signs, and a decision to ignore both. It was April 22, 2016. The late afternoon light in Australia's Northern Territory had begun to flatten, the sun dropping toward the tree line and pulling the temperature down with it. The wet season had ended weeks earlier, leaving the river systems slow-moving and their surfaces opaque with suspended sediment. The vegetation along the banks was dense and green, still holding the moisture of the wet season, and the air carried the particular smell of warm water and mud that defines this landscape in the weeks after the rains. Daniel Reyes was 29 years old. He had been traveling through the region independently for several days, moving between campsites and river crossings with the loose itinerary of someone more interested in covering ground than in detailed planning. People who knew him described him as physically capable and self-reliant, someone who defaulted to his own judgment in situations where others might have paused to gather more information. He was not reckless in the way that word is sometimes applied to people who take obvious risks. He was the kind of person who assessed situations quickly and trusted his own read of them, a different kind of vulnerability, one that is harder to recognize from the inside because it presents itself as competence rather than carelessness. He had crossed other rivers. He had made other judgment calls. None of them had gone wrong, and that record had become its own form of evidence. Posted warnings at the river crossing were visible. They were not ambiguous. Daniel entered the water anyway. I don't think this was the right thing to do. When a sign is that direct, it usually means people have already died there. The crossing point had every characteristic that makes saltwater crocodile ambush attacks statistically likely. The current was slow, the entry banks were soft and gradual, the water was opaque, and the light was low, the period during which saltwater crocodiles are most actively hunting. These are not obscure facts. They are the basis of the warning signs posted at that specific crossing. Saltwater crocodiles are ambush predators in the most complete sense of the term. They do not pursue prey across open ground. They wait, submerged or partially submerged, in conditions that make their detection nearly impossible, and they strike when proximity and timing align. The animal does not need to be seen. It needs only to be present and patient, and saltwater crocodiles are extraordinarily patient. They can hold position in the water for extended periods without any visible surface disturbance, monitoring the environment through senses that function effectively in conditions where human vision is useless. I can't see how anyone feels confident in water where you can't see your own feet. Daniel moved steadily through the water toward the far bank. The surface around him showed nothing. There was no movement, no sound, no visible indication of anything in the water with him. Midway through the crossing, the surface behind him broke. From where I'm standing, this is the point at which awareness no longer matters. The crocodile struck from below and behind, targeting the leg with the explosive upward lunge that saltwater crocodiles use from a submerged position. The force of the initial contact alone was sufficient to destabilize Daniel completely before any conscious response was possible. Within a second, he was pulled beneath the surface. The death roll, a rapid rotation along the animal's longitudinal axis, maintained while the jaws remain locked, was initiated almost immediately. The rotational force is sufficient to cause severe structural damage, disorienting the victim immediately and forcing submersion, with tearing and fractures occurring as the rotation continues. The crocodile does not need to be larger than its prey for the technique to be effective. It needs only to initiate the roll before the prey can establish any counter leverage, and in water, from a submerged ambush position, that window is effectively zero. There was no visible struggle above the surface. The water moved briefly, then settled. The river returned to stillness within moments. Daniel's body was located by search teams the following day, recovered from deeper water downstream. The warning signs at the crossing remained in place. Daniel Reyes had entered dangerous water once and paid immediately. The next case is slower, a pattern of behavior repeated across multiple visits, each one uneventful, each one making the next feel safer, until the animal had been changed in ways that could not be undone. It was January 11th, 2018. The Canadian Rockies in winter carry a particular kind of cold, dry and penetrating, the kind that arrives without wind and settles into everything it touches. The sky that morning was clear and pale, the mountains visible in sharp relief against it, the snow on the upper slopes undisturbed and bright in the low winter light. The roads through the national park were passable but quiet, the summer crowds long gone, the landscape reduced to its essential elements: rock, snow, conifer, and the occasional animal moving through the open ground near the tree line. Olivia Grant was 41 years old. She lived in a city several hours from the park, but had been making regular visits to the region for years, drawn by the wildlife viewing that the park's protected status made possible. She was not a wildlife professional. She had no formal training in animal behavior or wildlife management, but she had spent enough time in the park to feel familiar with its rhythms, and that familiarity had, over time, produced a set of habits that felt to her like a deepening relationship with the landscape and its animals. The habit of leaving food at the roadside turnout had begun gradually, a small amount left near the vehicle, an animal that approached and took it, the satisfaction of a close encounter that felt intimate and unscripted. It escalated through repetition and the absence of immediate negative consequences, until it had become a routine that Olivia returned to on each visit without reconsidering what it was doing to the animal on the other side of it. Wildlife management authorities prohibit feeding wildlife not primarily because of the immediate risk to the person doing the feeding, but because of what the behavior does to the animal over time. Grizzly bears that receive food from humans undergo a measurable and well-documented behavioral shift. The wariness that keeps wild grizzlies at a safe distance from people begins to erode with each feeding interaction. The animal learns to associate human presence with food reward. It begins to approach rather than retreat. It begins to monitor hands and vehicles rather than maintain distance. The threshold at which it will initiate physical contact drops progressively, and the animal has no mechanism for distinguishing between a person who intends to feed it and a person who does not. A food-conditioned grizzly is not simply a bold bear, it is an animal whose relationship to humans has been fundamentally restructured, and that restructuring cannot be undone through a single negative interaction. By the time wildlife managers are aware it has occurred, the animal is often already operating at a level of habituation that makes safe coexistence impossible. From my perspective, this is one of those actions where the harm isn't immediate, so it gets underestimated. One bear in particular had been approaching Olivia directly for several days before January 11th, closing to within a few meters before she had even reached into her bag. On the morning of the incident, it approached before she had made any gesture toward food at all. It watched her hands. It had learned to read the sequence of her behavior and was anticipating the next step in a routine it had participated in many times. I wouldn't have kept encouraging that pattern, even once it started feeling predictable. When Olivia extended her hand forward, the bear huffed a sharp, low exhalation and closed distance in a slow forward press, maintaining forward pressure rather than committing immediately. This is consistent with food-conditioned behavior. The animal was not startled, and it was not retreating. It was pushing into a space it had been allowed to occupy before, testing whether the usual sequence would continue. When it did not, when Olivia pulled her hand back sharply, the contact came fast. The bear swatted at her outstretched arm at close range, and the force of it knocked her off balance. She turned and stumbled. The sudden shift, a figure turning, losing its footing, dropping in posture, registered as something that altered the dynamic of an already unstable encounter. The bear advanced again. It knocked her to the ground and delivered bites to her upper body and arms. She was on the ground, disoriented, and unable to rise, when the second bear moved in from the tree line. The second bear's approach, when it came, was not coordinated. It had been present throughout, monitoring from a distance it had clearly occupied before, at the margin of a location it associated with food reward. What drew it forward was not the first bear's behavior, but the stimulus of the encounter itself. Movement on the ground, sounds of distress, the continued presence of a human figure at a site it had conditioned itself to approach. It did not enter as a partner in an attack. It entered the way food-conditioned animals enter uncertain situations, opportunistically, drawn by association, closing distance because nothing in its conditioning told it to stay back. The first bear remained the primary aggressor. The second bear's contribution was less deliberate. It circled, it closed distance, and at moments when Olivia shifted or tried to rise, it made contact. What it prevented, more than anything, was recovery. Every time the first bear briefly disengaged, the second bear's presence, close, unpredictable, not retreating, eliminated any window in which Olivia might have been able to stabilize herself or move clear. That's when you know the damage is already wider than one incident. The location itself had become the problem, and the full weight of that was playing out in real time. There was no sustained stillness that would allow the encounter to end in the way a single animal defensive attack typically ends. The attack did not break when she stopped moving. Both animals remained present and engaged for longer than the first bear would have persisted alone. Wildlife officers who responded after a passing, motorists reported seeing 2 bears at the roadside turnout with a person on the ground, found the scene already settled. Both animals withdrawn a short distance, the ground around the turnout marked clearly by what had happened. Olivia Grant did not survive. The injuries to the torso, combined with the time elapsed before first medical contact in the cold, had produced a result that could not be reversed. The decision that followed was not automatic. Wildlife agencies in the region assess each case individually, weighing the degree of habituation, the history of prior incidents, and whether relocation is a viable option. A conditioned grizzly relocated to a new area does not leave its conditioning behind. It carries the learned associations with it, and typically resumes food-seeking behavior around humans within its new range. In this case, The evidence of sustained, deliberate conditioning across multiple visits, combined with confirmed fatal contact, placed both animals outside the threshold for relocation. Wildlife authorities determined both animals were no longer suitable for coexistence in the area and were euthanized by wildlife officers. The outcome they represented had been created incrementally across multiple visits by the person who had fed them. Olivia Grant's habit had altered the animals gradually through repetition until they were operating on conditioning rather than instinct. The final case involves no conditioning and no prior relationship, only a bull elephant, a set of readable warning signals, and a man who recognized them and stepped closer anyway. It was August 9th, 2014. The dry season in northern Botswana had pushed the wildlife toward the remaining water sources, concentrating animals along the river systems and floodplains in numbers that made the national park one of the most densely populated wildlife areas on the continent during this period. The afternoon heat was significant and unrelenting, the kind that creates a visible shimmer above the open ground and keeps most large animals in shade until the temperature begins to drop. Robert Klein was 52 years old. He had traveled to the region specifically for wildlife photography, and, by the accounts of those who accompanied him, was experienced enough to understand the general rules of engagement with large animals in the field. He had been on safari before. He understood the protocols around vehicle-based wildlife viewing, the importance of staying inside the vehicle, the distances that experienced guides maintain, the behavioral signals that indicate an animal's tolerance for proximity is being exceeded. He understood these things well enough to recognize them when explained. He had, by multiple accounts, been given exactly that explanation earlier in the trip. On the afternoon of August 9th, he chose to disregard it. Robert exited his vehicle to photograph a bull elephant at close range. The elephant was already aware of him before he stepped out. The animal had not failed to notice his presence. It had registered him, assessed him, and was already in a state of active monitoring by the time Robert placed himself on the ground in the open, with no barrier between himself and an animal that weighed several tons. From my perspective, this is already past the point where experience matters. Distance is the only real control you have. The initial signals were present and readable. The elephant lifted its head. Its trunk curled inward. Its body began a slow, deliberate orientation towards the source of the disturbance. These are documented pre-charge indicators, not ambiguous, not subtle to anyone with field experience. They are the behavioral vocabulary through which elephants communicate escalating threat assessment, well established enough that guides in these areas are trained to recognize and respond to them immediately, without waiting to see what comes next. As Robert stepped closer, the signals escalated. I don't think this was the right thing to do. Closing distance during escalation removes every possible exit. The ears spread wide, the body squared forward. Short, deliberate steps closed a small amount of the distance between them. A mock charge followed, fast, covering significant ground, stopping short of contact. Mock charges in African elephants are not ambiguous. They are a final, committed warning. The animal demonstrating through the full physical expression of a charge that it is capable of, completing it, and that the only variable preventing contact is the intruder's response. Every experienced guide treats a mock charge as the last point at which retreat is still the available outcome. Robert did not retreat. This is the moment the range of possible outcomes narrows sharply. The interval between the mock charge and the full charge was minimal. The elephant committed without further escalation, without additional warning, without any further interval in which a different outcome was possible. The acceleration was immediate and total, closing the distance before any evasive movement was possible. The impact was followed by trampling, brief and forceful. Once the threat had been neutralized, the elephant disengaged and moved off into the surrounding bush at a steady pace, its posture returning to the baseline it had held before the encounter began. From the animal's perspective, the interaction was complete, and the outcome had been the only one available from the moment Robert stepped out of the vehicle.